am Elizabeth Warner, and I am presenting the fourth in a series about SMART, which is sensory motor arousal regulation treatment. And you have had an introduction to and somewhat of an overview of SMART given by Alex Cook in the first meeting. And in the second meeting, Heather Finn introduced you to proprioceptive input, one of the sensory motor systems that we're interested in. And then last week, Anne Westcott talked about tactile input and touch, another important sensory motor input that is very helpful in SMART. And I am going to talk about vestibular input, the third in our series of four that we're talking about in this TRF presentation. So I'm going to share screen. Okay, so vestibular input and somatic regulation. So we like to call it rockin' and rollin' in the SMART room. And as I show you these pictures, you're going to see why. All kids like this kind of input, and kids in SMART particularly love this kind of input, and hence our interest in it. It's a real active kind of play that generates vestibular input. So here you see a girl rolling over a ball and a boy rocking on a big dolphin pillow. Here's spinning, which is a very strong vestibular input. And this final one is balancing. And of course, there are multiple other ways that kids get vestibular input. It's the most stimulating of the inputs. And in fact, there's only one type of experience that we see in the SMART room that requires a special tending to safety, if you will, and that's spinning. And that's because that can be so stimulating to the brain, actually, and kids can overdo it. So we have some guidelines about that. But we call it rockin' and rollin' in here, and it's a very playful and active kind of input. But it's also one of the most interesting ones, and we wanted to delve into it further. What was it doing for kids? This was really the question. With rare exceptions, it does not seem to dysregulate kids, but rather it does something else. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So you were introduced to the SMART spiral, which is really talking about the three different therapeutic processes in SMART: somatic regulation, trauma processing, and attachment. And the goal of the treatment is not, for example, trauma processing per se, but really the development of a sense of self in kids. And that's where we came up with this sort of image to say that, again, these are the therapeutic processes that are important, but really what we're aiming for is for the child to develop a core sense of self. And the vestibular input seems to have some interesting impact on that, which I can show you a little bit about today. But we're looking to free up the healthy developmental processes that trauma has interrupted, impacted, stalled in some way. Today, I'm going to talk about vestibular input as it relates to somatic regulation. That's what we've been focusing on. It does have some impact on trauma processing in particular, but we don't have time for that today. And this is to show you the way in which we see these four inputs as central to what happens in the SMART room with kids, what happens spontaneously with the kids. And you heard about proprioception and the tactile, and again, vestibular, I'm going to talk about today. And then next week, Anne Westcott will talk about rhythm. And these seem to both work together and separately for somatic regulation. You were introduced to the developmental hierarchy, and I think you were shown the way in which our entry point in this therapy is at the lower levels of the developmental hierarchy. So that is, again, the sensory processing foundations, the physiological regulation and rhythmicity. So this arousal regulation is something that we're seeking when kids are outside their window. And then engaging the core motor functions. And those are the really essential processes that we're engaging initially. But the outcome is interesting, and the outcome within sessions, and then the outcome over time, which is the integration of the upper 3 layers of this developmental hierarchy. And we think the vestibular input has something to do with that. So I'm going to show you just a short little slideshow to show you how kids who come into the Smart Room seek vestibular input. And you'll get a sense of why we call it rockin' and rollin' here.
We want some more. This is the third time.
You gonna tell me? Was that a stop? Yeah. Okay. That was a funny go. That was a funny stop. You told me in a funny way.
So one of the interesting things about taking these pictures, these were pictures of kids we are related to, so models, not clients, obviously. And what we saw those kids do was pretty similar to what the kids coming in for treatment do in there. So the activity level, the engagement with the equipment was very similar. So it was very easy to use these pictures as demonstrations for you of what happens in the Smart Room. Here's 2 photos, though, showing actual clients, so I think you can't really identify them. So it felt okay to use them. But these are examples of therapeutic play and the use of vestibular input in the Smart Room with a therapist, and in one case with a caregiver. And again, this is the kind of vestibular input that kids seek spontaneously. These things are not suggested necessarily by the therapist. And on the left, you see a little boy trying to balance on this balance beam. And there's a lot of engagement with this, and his mom is commenting on it. And then she remembers, oh, he's learning to ride his 2-wheeler. And he kind of, perks up and comments on it himself. So there's a balance beam thing here, which is him getting himself sort of centered and able to control his body. And then on the right, you see a game that got created between a therapist and a boy. And this is a chase me game and a kind of you're it game. And they're chasing each other around the room. But in the context of this, there's a lot of modulation of what he's doing. So we think that neglect is one of the ways that this getting the adequate vestibular input is truncated, that kids don't have enough opportunity and experience to get the input they need to their brain. But it's very important to grounding, centering, and general regulation. So the vestibular system has receptors in the inner ear, which help register our movement in 3-dimensional space and our relationship to gravity. Very important. And we know that in the brain, there's a very complex vestibular network that goes from those receptors in the inner ear to the brain stem, to the posterior insula, okay, where interoceptive awareness is developed, and the temporoparietal junction, where our relationship, our exteroception, our perception of ourself in relation to the environment is processed, and then eventually to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which has something to do with motor planning and action and intention in our in what we're doing. So the network is a very complex network in the brain. Vestibular input is super important for development in all these ways. It's complicated. I'll read them off, but there's a lot to be said for it. So it's important for developing spatial awareness and spatial relationships, for interhemispheric communication between the 2 hemispheres, for safe movement through space, for a sense of balance and equilibrium, for the bilateral coordination of both sides of the body and establishing dominance, for use of the two eyes together for gaze and for tracking, something that's important. The tracking is important for reading. And of course, eye gaze is something important in attachment building for eye contact. And then for rhythm, development of rhythm and timing, there's a connection to the cerebellum. So this is a very complex input. It has many important developmental functions. And a core sense of self depends on this. So it depends on a sense of balance and a sense of equilibrium, our having a center of gravity and an experience of stability in one's body. Okay, and I think you all who work with trauma can immediately sense why that's important in terms of trauma. The location of one's body in space, where am I in relation to people and things around me? To ego motion, which is the experience of agency in action, that I am doing something, where am I moving and why am I doing it? And then finally to first person perspective, holding a first person perspective. So the vestibular system is key to this fully embodied self. So when I talk about bottom-up processing, I know you were introduced to that. We're talking about using these inputs for processing in the brain. But what we see with the use of vestibular input, as well as the other sensory inputs together, is that it engages the upper levels of the brain so that top-down processing can be part of the deal. So what does vestibular input possibly look like in your office? Okay, with adults, for example, or perhaps with kids who are not so terribly dysregulated. So here's an example. And you see Heather Finn in a glider that we have, and I'll show you one in the office that I'm working out of right now. And so it was interesting because we asked some patients at the trauma center to use this and to tell us what they experienced, to use the glider. And one said, she said, I'm more present. I'm noticing my feet on the ground. I didn't notice that before. Another client, and they'd all been sitting in this stiff back chair, an ordinary chair that it was very static. And this client who went into the glider said, it's more comfortable. I feel more still, even though she's moving, right? There's more room. I don't feel compelled to cross my arms. I feel more sturdy in my hips and in my upper back, more stable. I feel my feet on the ground. That's a pretty profound change. On the right, you see, this is my nephew actually, and this is him working at a standing desk and standing on a balance board that can spin around. And he says, I've always been an active, fidgety person. But once I started working, standing and balancing my working, I realized I would never sit down to work. Now that I can stand, dance, spin, and move my body while doing work, I am far more awake, alert, and productive. While sitting down, I would feel sluggish, have trouble getting out of my chair when I needed to, and I always felt tired. Okay, this isn't a problem on the balance board. I feel better, healthier, and produce better quality work. So I want to show you just a few things in this office that we did. This is a standard office, not our smart room, which you saw in another one, but we put some chairs in here that move. And this is very important for use with adults. So you're going to see the glider, and Pat's going to tell me if you don't see me.
Good.
Okay, that's good. So you see the back and forth movement. This is kind of a linear movement, and it's very gentle. But all the adults that I've been bringing into this office have chosen these chairs over the couch. Okay, here's another one. And I know it's a little hard to see me, but I'm just arcing in this chair, gently arcing. Now, one could do it a little more vigorously, but a lot of times when people are in their psychotherapy, they're just gently moving like this. Okay. Here's another kind of chair. I'm sure many of you have seen these balls. And I saw a couple last week, and the wife said, I have a little trouble with my back. Can I sit on that? And she found herself able to both stabilize herself and to straighten her back very comfortably. And she sat on this the entire session while talking to her husband. So that was very useful for her. Sometimes people can get on a balance board. So if you see this balance board here, it's a little bit like the one my nephew's on, except that it just rocks back and forth. But even a little bit of balancing is very centering for somebody, because there's a focus on what is my body doing in order to find my center of gravity. Okay, so this is something anybody can have in their office. And then finally, the desk chair that I'm using spins. Now, those of you who've worked with kids have probably had kids get in this spinning chair, your spinning office chair, and spin round and round and round. Okay, so this one will be familiar to you. But, you know, some adults like that too. They like this range of motion. And it, as Sam said, it helps him concentrate. It helps him feel alert. So these are moving chairs, and it's interesting how much adults choose these chairs over the staticness of the couch. So I'm going to show you a little brief moment in a suspended hammock. This is another piece of equipment that is much more complicated to set up for oneself. You have to have a room with suspension and, you know, adequate support for it and that sort of thing. But I wanted to just introduce it because of the way that it impacts. Now, this person who's telling us about it is a therapist who found it useful for herself and was willing to talk about what it's like for her.
Hammock is like tight around my body, so I'm getting a little bit of like pressure input kind of around my back, and then I'm also enclosed in it, so I'm feeling like kind of contained inside of something, and then the movement too is also soothing. So I think there's like multiple sensory inputs happening at one time.
Where do you notice the soothing in your body?
Kind of in my core, like I'm noticing an impulse to kind of just like close my eyes and relax my shoulders a little bit more too.
Pat, is it hard for people to hear, you think?
I can't hear anything.
Okay, so she's talking about the feeling of the hammock around her. Okay, she can feel it. She's having a sensory experience of it. It feels soothing. It feels calming. The little bit of movement feels helpful to her. Okay, and she's talking about that. And when I ask her what she's aware of in her body, she notices her core. And later in this video, which we won't see all of, she talks about how her core is weak. And she doesn't always experience it, but here she's experiencing the core. But that little bit of movement is calming to her.
Mm-hmm. Explore that a little, see what it feels like, see how it is actually to do that.
I think you can feel like I'm kind of noticing myself like relax and like trust the hammock a little bit, that it's kind of like got me, like as I relax I still feel the like, it's kind of hard to find the word I guess, but the like the containment, there's like something holding me, I guess,
So she's using words like relax and trust and containment and feeling held. So these experiences are all generated in the context of this hammock. Now, one of the interesting things is that at the end, she talks about how she was unable to use vinyasa yoga because her mind was always wandering. And so somehow she got introduced to aerial yoga. And when she started doing aerial yoga, the experience was very different for her. And she engaged pretty strongly in the aerial yoga. And then later, when she went back to floor yoga, she was able to do it and stay centered in her body But part of what she learned in this context was deeper breathing. And I'll show just a second of that.
Don't like need it as much.
This
Like
is
before,
how
I would
she
never
learned
choose
it.
to do a vinyasa class over this. Do like kids could spin
Oh, yeah.
a little, but anyway.
So go through what you were just explaining about the breath.
Do you want me to explain it again or just do it?
Yeah, well, do it and then explain it.
Now, she needed it.
So in order to come up from being upside down, I had to learn how to engage my core a little bit. And at first, that was challenging.
Oops, sorry. So she says, in order to, to breathe more deeply, she had to engage her core. And it was this kind of exercise done with a teacher that helped her deepen her breathing. And she talks about it with quite a bit of, expressiveness. We don't have time to listen to the whole thing, but this is engaging not only the tactile input around the body, but a lot of gentle vestibular input, which is seeming to help her move back into floor yoga when she is ready to do that. So the role of movement in child and adult trauma treatments. Here's what I want to say about this. With this brief information in mind, the question is, do we restrict people from access to necessary sensory and motor information to better navigate their environments, to self-regulate, and to engage with us if we do not allow for spontaneous movement in psychotherapy? And believe me, I had an office with chairs where people sat in chairs that didn't move for a long time. Restriction of this neural information may be asking the person to heal with one hand tied behind their back, hobbled by insufficient and inadequate neural stimulation to integrate the brain. So we know now from all our work in SMART that multisensory integration is what leads to a core sense of being. So an awareness of our bodies in relation to the environment and to others. And we know that there are many therapeutic opportunities for kids to get this kind of multisensory integration. So we work with kids in SMART, but as soon as they're ready for kids, moving into classes of gymnastics or dance or circus arts or martial arts or equine therapy or athletics for fun or drama therapy, these are ways to give them the kinds of inputs that they need in order to regulate their bodies and to organize themselves. So that's my strongest message, is that this is part of getting the sensory motor input that kids need to develop and that we think will facilitate change for people, and including adults. So we don't go into as much detail about the vestibular input in our book, but there's plenty of examples in the book, and I hope you guys will have a chance to take a look at it. So thank you, and Pat, I'll turn it over to you for any questions.
All right. So we do have one question. This is more of a practical question. Trying to turn on my video. Should turn on in a second. Joe is wondering, are there certain brands of balance boards that you recommend, and which one is the one you were using there?
I don't think so. We have a lot of different balance materials. Anne showed you these things last week, I think, that could be used for tactile input, but they also could be used for vestibular input, because if you stand on them, you have to pay attention to keeping your center of gravity and balancing. So those are fine. This balance board is a nice wooden one, and it's good for people who are a little bit feel a little insecure in terms of their center of gravity. This one is by Power Systems, it's called. But, you can find a lot of things that will serve the same function.
The next question I have here, is there any articles or information on SMART and equine therapy?
Not directly, but we worked a lot with therapists who were doing equine therapy. And in fact, because some of the principles are the same, And we did some co-consulting on it with them. One actually, a very creative equine therapist set up she called it a little smart stall, if you will. There was a child who was very frightened of going in with the horse. And so she built a little room for them to start to accommodate to the barn. The child very much wanted to do it, but was very frightened. And so she worked in this room, which, had hay on the floor and that sort of thing. It was very creative. But equine therapy is a wonderful example of use of the body.
Another good question here. Do you encourage parents to buy some of these things to teach them at home to follow up with the treatment, or is it better to keep it separate?
No, not at all. It's very, I'll tell you what happens. The minute kids start to like something, they want it at home. So we talk to parents about how to get equipment at home that helps them with their regulation. We tie it to the regulation, but often it just sort of happens organically. We don't even have to prescribe it because the kids will say, oh, I want one of these for my bedroom, or can I have one of these at home? So the transfer to generalization to home is easy because of that. And it happened in residential treatment centers. The equipment would start disappearing into kids' rooms. So they realized they had to have a budget for more equipment, weighted blankets, physio balls, those kinds of things. I mean, this is a very accessible therapy we've found with caregivers. For those who participate, it's wonderful because the generalization of things to home is much easier rather than telling the parent about it. They're part of what's happening in the room. Some parents are very actively engaged. Others may just sit and watch. And participate, if you will, by witnessing what's happening or noticing what's happening. Some people don't, maybe have physical limitations, but they can still be there and be witnesses, if you will. Okay, so next week, you're going to hear about the fourth very important input, which is rhythm. And Anne Westcott is going to present on that. We've done a coding study of tape, and one of the interesting things we learned was that vestibular and rhythm input were interesting specific regulators in a way. That proprioception and tactile input were being used almost all the time, but that these two were specific kinds of regulators for kids, and kids seek them. They seek them out. It's not, again, much of this happens organically in the room, and the therapist can just build on what's happening organically. But Anne will talk more about rhythm and rhythms of engagement.